All right, who's excited for, I think, one of the best panels we have at Disrupt this year? So we have so many people on the stage, we can't even fit them all on the PowerPoint slide up here. But we have a fantastic panel on probably one of the most important topics that every startup faces, which is how to build, grow, and iterate your product. I'm going to quickly go down and introduce everyone to my right. Immediately next to me is Manik Gupta, Chief Product Officer at Uber. Next, we have Diya Jolly, Chief Product Officer of Okta, an enterprise identity management platform. Next, Ravi Mehta, the Chief Product Officer at Tinder. And finally, Robby Stein, Head of Product, Consumer Products for Instagram. An amazing panel. I want to start back at the beginning of your careers. One thing that all five of us have in common is that we all started our careers at 3 companies: Microsoft, Google, and Facebook. And I'm curious why in product management so many people in leadership positions like yourselves seem to be starting their careers in just a handful of places.
So, yeah, I started at Google in 2007, and at least for me, it was because I was building technology products in college, and I just wanted something that kind of felt entrepreneurial and where I could really learn. And Google was just this center of energy at the time, and it felt like anything was possible. And so it was also very early where there weren't tons of tech jobs. And so I went over, moved to San Francisco, started Mountain View on the Gmail team, and started building for Gmail. And I think the exposure to how to try things, fail, and learn with real users and real products is probably the best experience you could possibly get. And that was one of the best places to do it.
So I actually started in 1998 at Microsoft. I was one of the early people on the online gaming team at Microsoft, and then working on Xbox Live. At the time, product management didn't even really exist in the way that it exists today. Product managers at Microsoft are still called program managers. And at that point, the industry was trying to figure out this kind of triad between engineering, design, product management, marketing management. Like, how does that all lay out? And Microsoft was one of the early companies trying to figure that out and really defining what it means to be a product manager. I think one of the things that made my experience at Microsoft, and I think other large companies, so valuable from a product management standpoint, is you get to deal with problems across a pretty large dynamic range, from early startup type of things. So, in our case, we were figuring out how do we build a game console in a market that was traditionally dominated by Japanese players. And so that required a lot of things that you would typically do at a startup in terms of really understanding the market, understanding the early ecosystem, how to build that ecosystem, all the way through to how do you build and run a product at significant scale. So the ability to work across that dynamic range is something that the big companies offer, and it's a really good foundation from a product management standpoint. I think one thing that's sort of unique to product management is it is a role that's not well defined, and where adaptability and flexibility and ability to think creatively comes into play almost every day. And so that big company experience gives you the ability to get that flexibility and adaptability.
Thank you.
For me, I think I love building products. I love building products, getting them out there, being used by customers. I love touching all ranges of technology. I joke around. If you look at my background, I've done every kind of known product management possible, whether it's hardware, software, consumer, enterprise, big company, small company, medium company. And I think for me, I've worked at both Microsoft and Google, and for me, really, I get attracted to places that are building stuff that's innovative, right, that are trying to change the trends in an industry. And when you get into companies like that and you have like-minded people around you, for me, it's really about, like, how am I going to change the future of the world? And that drives me, right? And over the last few decades, I think Microsoft, Google, and Facebook have had more than their share of innovations and technologies that they've rolled out, which is why I went to both Microsoft and Google.
Yeah. So my first job right out of college was I was an entrepreneur. I started my own company, and after a while, when I was looking to change my career, it was obvious that I will end up at a company like Google. So I joined Google in India in 2008, and this was kind of the first phase, if you will, of the internet revolution in those markets, especially the emerging markets. Obviously, a lot of the internet users are growing much more in those markets at this point. So I joined Google in 2008, and I think the most important thing for me, and connecting back to the product management side, is these companies have figured out a way to really foster the spirit of entrepreneurship. So you come in and you're working on really, really important ideas, big ideas, consumer scale, millions, hundreds of millions of users, and the impact is just there. So there's, it's true that a lot of folks who have grown up in these companies go on and become, strong product leaders because the challenges that these companies pose, the kinds of problems that they solve, and the solutions that they bring and the scale that they bring is just an incredible training experience for anybody who builds their career over there.
So I want to address the topic of this panel, which is around iterating your product. So, one of the most important parts of iterating a product is getting user feedback. How do users use your product? What are they looking for? And you've all had experiences in category-defining companies where you have millions of users, you get a ton of feedback, but when you start as a founder, oftentimes you might only have 10 users, or you might only have a couple dozen. How does it change when you're super early and getting feedback, when you might only have maybe your parents or someone on the product?
Hopefully. Yeah.
Hopefully.
Want each of us to answer?
Go for it.
Okay. So, interestingly enough, there's more similarities than differences if you're at a startup in a big company. Because at the end of the day, you just want you want to solve a problem for someone. And if you just talk to 5 or 6 people and you show them your product, it's crazy how quickly you can actually get signal on if it's useful or not. Most people will not use anything that you build because the default energy is just to keep doing what they usually do. So to get anyone who's really excited about it is valuable. And a lot of the products, even at Instagram, that we've built, started with just a few people that we've talked to learn from them. I think the other thing is it's easy to actually understand people's problems, and I think people have a pretty good understanding of what bothers them and their pain. And so we spend a lot of our time when we're talking to people understanding what problems they have. It's easier to articulate, it's easier to explain to someone else, like what's bothering me throughout a day, what's difficult to use, what's something I want to do that I can't do with products that exist today. And we really try to focus on those areas before we build anything. It's a lot harder to figure out the actual solution from talking to people. That's really where I think the creativity and engineering prowess of the team comes into play to solve solutions in a way that's better than what's out there today. So we usually focus on pretty small groups of people. We focus more on the problem side of things, and then we test solutions after we've created them. And I think the only big difference between the smaller company and the bigger one is you just have less data, and so you have to rely much more on the human-to-human interaction. But when you're trying to build something new, even at a bigger company, you still have to just be really close to the user as much as possible. And I find even pretty small conversations with 6 to 10 people to be very valuable.
I think when you're at a larger company, you do have scale, you have the ability to learn analytically, you have the ability to learn through experiments, but at the end of the day, usage of your product really comes down to one person using your product and getting value from your product. So I think as a startup, you actually have a privilege in that you don't have a large user base. You have to learn through talking to your users and really understanding what that use case is, what problems they're trying to solve. And that's a privilege that I think early startups that are successful use that to full effect to really completely understand their customers and try to drive towards something that's solving a really meaningful problem in their lives. I think once you get to a larger scale, there's actually a tendency to look at numbers rather than looking at people. And that can be helpful, like being able to get that sort of signal at scale and with statistical significance is really valuable. But at the same time, you're always sort of looking at things black and white through the numbers. You can understand what's happening, but it's much harder to understand why something is happening. And a single one-on-one conversation can highlight a million points of data in terms of really understanding why something is happening. So I think having those one-to-one conversations with customers, whether you're small, whether you're big, is really important. And when you do have those, I think a lot of times companies make the mistake of really laser focusing in on the particular problem that you're trying to solve and learning all about that particular problem in that person's lives. One of the things that we try to do at Tinder when we have conversations is really take a step back and get to know the users, get to know what their life is like, what things they're doing, what their interests are, what their hobbies are, how they meet their friends, how they meet people that they date, how they meet online, how they meet offline, the last time they went out with their friends, the last time they went out on a date. And so all of those things help us to create like a 360-degree picture of a user, which really helps to highlight what are the edges of the problem. If you zone specifically in on the solution that you're trying to solve, you often miss the underlying thing that you're trying to solve for the user.
Mm-hmm.
So my take on this is it depends on the type of product problem you're trying to solve, right? If you are trying to add more features and functionality to an existing product, then more users give you more information with less noise. So there's a higher signal to noise ratio. However, when you're trying to develop a product that's brand new and potentially changing what you do from a paradigm perspective, then actually talking to users is very, very helpful. And it doesn't matter if you're in a company with millions of users or you're in a startup, because really you are going to anchor on a focus group, 15 to 20 people with a product concept. An example of this is when I was working on Google Home, the initial reaction was, use your voice for what? Right? I mean, if you did an experiment there and put a speaker in front of people, I don't know how much you would have learned. But as we started talking to people and started figuring out what kind of things they would prefer to use their voice for, it became super important. Right? So I think that's where I draw the distinction. It's not on how many users you have. The different tactics you take depend on the different types of product problems you're going to solve, and it doesn't vary from a startup to a big company.
Yeah, I think a bunch of points have been covered. So I'll offer 2 insights. So the first one is I've had the opportunity to work on a free product, which is Google Maps, and then now working on a paid product, which is Uber. So one thing that I learned back at Google Maps is if you can figure out a way to continuously get user feedback through a flow that makes sense to the user, and the user is also helping you solve their own pain points, that is a very scalable way to build it out. So if you use Google Maps, one of the most important things in there is the quality and accuracy of the data. So we built a ton of flows in Google Maps itself, whether it's on mobile or desktop, to allow users to either report problems directly or even fix some of them themselves. And that actually ended up being a very comprehensive and scalable way to, not just to take in the feedback from users, but act on it automatically, and then scale it out in such a way that the user got instant gratification because they fixed something as well, right? You see this in apps like Waze, where people can report traffic incidents and things like that. So one of the things that if you can do in your startup or in a company is if you can convert a mechanism of collecting user feedback and make that into an engagement channel also for the user, it is a very, very nice flywheel that you can build. So that's one insight that I wanted to share. The other one is at Uber, connecting back to what folks were saying, as you become a bigger company, you have hundreds of millions of users and so on, it does become harder for you to just continue to use just data that is coming from the users to experiment. I mean, of course, you should do that for optimization, but if you're building new features, then you have to really go out and talk to the users. So a year ago, we launched a couple of loyalty programs. We launched a loyalty program for drivers. We launched a loyalty program for riders. And there's no way that you can kind of experiment and build that. You have to, so we have a very strong driver base that we talk to on a regular basis. We have roundtables all around the world. There's a global aspect of product building as well, because what works in the United States might not work in India. So you have a lot of user feedback coming in, especially as you launch new features, and that is how you actually go build it out. So that's a combination of a way in which you can scalably, in the flow, have user feedback that allows the users to provide you structured feedback and also improve the product on a continuous basis, and also talk to the users as needed to build new features. I think that's where you have to sort of find the right fit.
I want to talk a little bit about the velocity of iteration. So obviously, the received wisdom in Silicon Valley is you want to iterate your product as fast as possible. You want to get as much user feedback as possible, be experimenting, testing all the time. On the flip side, from a user experience perspective, there's this challenge, right, which is the product's always changing, the user interface, the buttons are in different places every time I'm logging onto the app. How do you sort of balance, your desire to get new data and try new features with, sort of the user's perspective of, stability helps me to learn the product better?
I think it's really important that you have a stronger point of view of what you want to accomplish before you start building anything. And I think at Instagram, we have a really strong principle around simplicity. And one of the things that we do is we don't start designing or building anything unless we feel like we actually have a problem to solve for someone. And I think it all starts with constraint in a good way, and having a really clear view of these are the things that are really issues for my users, and here are the things that I want to build. And I think that if I did build it, and you had a line of sight towards it being successful, it could be a game changer for people. And you keep a very high bar for what you want to actually introduce into the product. And if you do those things, now you've really filtered your ideas down to the very best ones. And just by even doing that, you're going to limit the amount of changes in the product. I think the other aspect is then how, when you introduce experiences, do you make them as intuitive as possible to use? And then there's a set of design principles around making sure you have familiarity in the design affordances that you use, making sure that you're within the natural flows of how someone expects to use your product, and you introduce it in a way that makes sense and doesn't go against the grain of what users are using the product for. And if you do those things well, you'll probably have less change to the product, and when you do change the product, it'll feel fairly natural. And so that's generally the process that we use. And we also just try to really learn, now that obviously we are a large company with a billion people that are using the product, we can learn very quickly from what's working and not, and then try not to make the same mistakes twice. And I think we've always had a strong principle around it's okay to fail as long as you learn and you don't make the same mistake again. And that again also helps you from just making constant changes over and over again into the app.
Diya, you've worked on both consumer and enterprise products. How is it now at Okta, where you have enterprise clients and probably more contractual obligations with all of your customers? Are you able to iterate the product as fast as?
So I was thinking about what you said. I think as long as, so in enterprise, you absolutely have a slightly slower pace of iteration. Or the innovation doesn't slow down, but it comes out in bigger bangs. And that's because your enterprises or your customers have to adopt what you're using, and they can't constantly change what you're using or adopt what you're using and educate their own users, right? In consumer, it's easier. You can roll out a bunch of features, consumers experiment, et cetera, and they'll use it on their own. Having said that, I think the way I draw the line is a little bit, again, more agnostic to whether it's consumer or enterprise. And my personal philosophy is, having worked in both, their product development isn't dramatically different in either case. And I can talk a little bit more about that if you're interested. But really, if it is, as Robby said, if it is in the natural flow of what the user is doing, if it is a functionality they're using and you're making it better by adding a couple of things, then people are going to hit into it naturally, and you will know whether they will learn, whether they will adopt, and you can iterate. If it is something that takes them away and they have to discover something, I'll use an example of with Uber. Uber Eats was not something they would discover naturally. Now, maybe with the placement in the app, right? But that is something you would have to educate users about that needed its own separate big bang, right? Versus if you improve the payment flow within Uber, that is something if somebody's paying, they might hit upon directly, and you'll know whether they like it or not, what your drop-off is. It's actually fairly similar in enterprises, where you can go in and change the UI and how things are configured and all of those changes fairly iteratively. We launch every month, right? You can change that pretty iteratively, but then there is like this big bang of new functionality we'll release, like multi-factor authentication or lifecycle management, where the companies will need to adopt it and configure it, and there you need some coaching and awareness to make that happen, and those you have to do in a big bang.
So a question for you, you have a huge amount of data, in these contexts, millions of users, all this quantitative data. When do you ignore the data entirely? When do you look at the user feedback and say, God, everyone loves this feature, but you know what, the design team is right. The app feature we just added, the Uber Eats button wasn't popular, but we're going to keep it there for some reason, or maybe it's something in Tinder. How do you think about ignoring user feedback when it's telling you opposite of what you're thinking?
Yeah, I think it's hard to say you fully ignore it, but I think you have to really contextualize all the information you see. And I think the metrics and how the product's used is just one signal you're getting in terms of what people need and what's valuable, but it's missing a lot of the color. And so I think the most important thing is that we're always intersecting how the product's changing and how usage is changing, and then really talking to each type of person to get a deeper sense of the why behind the data. And in doing that, you get more, I think, important trends come out. Like, I don't think we would have ever launched Instagram stories if we were specifically looking at testing our way with data and iterating our way through the product. It really much came from, okay, hey, let's talk to people and figure out why don't you feel like it's easy to share all of your moments on Instagram feed? And we realized that it was the pressure of feeling like it's permanent, it lasts on your profile, you have these likes that you want to kind of manage. And so we realized that a solution needed to be completely different than the product that we had today. And so again, it's really just getting at the why behind the data, and then you're able to build products that maybe would be things that data wouldn't have naturally led you to.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, the important thing is you have to instrument whatever you do from your app and from your process and so on, to make sure that you have the ability to collect feedback, collect the data along the way. And as you do that, you have to sort of contextualize that with everything else, right? If you just become a slave to the data that's coming to you, you're never going to, as Robby was saying, you're not going to look at new trends that emerge. And what we have done at Uber is that we figured out a way, we kind of give like a sandbox to teams right? Within the app or within us, we operate in 600 cities, so we just pick a city and say, in that city, we are just going to do a bunch of experiments. And only
Or Louisville.
Yeah, sure. Or choose whichever one. So we are able to then do that experiment over there. I wouldn't even call it an experiment. We ask the team to build the feature because they want to test it out and see how it works. And when we have the data and the user feedback, then we combine that. And of course, there's an instinct behind it. I mean, that's what product people do and design people do, right? There's an instinct behind the consumer behavior or the consumer pain point that you're trying to solve. And that is where the negotiation happens and the discussion happens. And then we also time box some of these experiments or these feature developments, and if we don't get the traction that we need, then we have to have a harder conversation that it's not working, and then we should be doing something else. So I think it's an art more than just like there's a dashboard where every data shows up and say, okay, this feature did well, let's just launch this, and this feature didn't. You have to kind of have that judgment applied, and data is a tool and not really the end all for how you make those decisions.
Robby, yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I think to build on that, really good product decisions, if you simplify it, really draw from three different things. They draw from your intuition of what makes a good product, the conversations that you're having with customers, so the qualitative insights that you're getting, and the quantitative insights that you're getting through the analytics that you're looking at day to day in terms of how your customers are using the product. I think teams tend to bias towards one mode of decision making or another. Some teams are more comfortable with database decision making. Some teams really rely more on their intuition. And I think one of the most challenging things to do, but the most important thing to do as a product leader, is to make sure that a team is drawing from all three of those things, from intuition, from qualitative feedback, and from quantitative analytics, to make decisions, and then synthesizing that together into a really interesting direction for the product. One example of that is on Sunday, Tinder's launching Swipe Night, which is a new interactive series. We're launching it at 6 p.m. It's a sort of interactive entertainment that you go through. The choices that you make within it help you match with people afterwards and help you have really fruitful conversations with those people. We could not have done user research specifically on that concept and gotten the information that we wanted. It was too new for people to wrap their heads around, where if we actually had presented it to them, they wouldn't have understood the concept, or they wouldn't have understood how that fits within Tinder. And so we used a combination of different inputs to try to understand the opportunity here and to build creatively towards that opportunity. And so we had sort of an intuition around how young people consume content and the important role that content plays in the conversations that we're having. We had quantitative data showing us and underpinning that intuition. And then when we did want to go to the market with qualitative insights, we actually built a quick and dirty prototype of the experience, put that into people's hands so that they could experience it rather than just hear about it or read about it. And by putting them actually in the moment, we were able to get a much better reaction to the concept and get the information that we needed in order to launch it. So that combination of intuition, analytics, and qualitative insight is really important to making good product decisions.
I want to follow up on this combination of inputs from one of the audience questions. And as a reminder, you can open up the TechCrunch Disrupt app to ask questions to this panel. It's how to iterate your product. One of the questions was around how do you work with an engineering team? So you're taking these combination of inputs, and that's your job on the team, right? Is you're looking at the analytics, you're looking at intuition, you're talking to your designers, you're this honest broker across all these teams, but at some point you have to translate your vision to an engineering team who doesn't see necessarily the same data. They may not even agree with what you're looking at. They might have their own opinions, having programmed the product directly. How do you sort of balance working with a team directly, sort of saying, hey, the order is this, versus taking that feedback and working with the team collaboratively?
I think if you're actually in the situation where you're rolling out the idea fully formed to the engineering team, the problem's already started. I think you need to get your designers, your engineers, your marketing folks all in the same room during that formative phase of the product. I think really good product management is more a matter of being a conductor than being the decider. And so if you have a team of diverse people with different backgrounds who are really committed to the purpose that you're trying to solve for, and who are as read into the information that we have at hand, you're going to get better decisions out of that. It can be uncomfortable for a PM to open up that decision making to the entire team, but I think it leads to better decisions. It also leads to better outcomes where the team is building against something that they really believe in. That was something that our Swipe Night team did really well. It was a creative concept, and it was something where the entire team of people focused on it, helped to build out the concept based on the feedback that we were hearing, the data that we were looking at, and that meant when it came time to build that and to do something that we hadn't done before, that was more complex than a lot of things that we had done in the past, everyone was really committed to that goal at hand, and that led to a much better outcome and much faster progress against the goal.
I also think it's based on the frame of mind that you have going into the process. And if you go in thinking the point of this working group is to increase the probability that we're right, that we built something that people love and adds value. And the way that you do that is to really walk the whole team through the thinking and to say, okay, start with the goal. What do we want? What's our aspiration of what we want to happen? Then what are the user problems? What's getting in the way of achieving that aspiration? Then, okay, what research and data do we have? And can we all show the homework? Like, what do we think actually is the prioritization of these problems based on talking to people, looking at the data, and literally be just completely transparent as if you have like your homework assignment and everyone can look at it and debate it. Then you're just getting better and better along the way. And then I think when everyone is on the same page relative to the aspiration and the problems, then that's really where the team's creativity shines. And whether it's engineering or design or individual, like other product managers on the team or other functions, I think great ideas can come from anywhere, but they're all kind of vetted through the same lens. And if you achieve that, I think you can harness the energy of the team, but also have it be fairly cohesive in how all that kind of ends up in the product.
Yeah, the thing I would add there is, if the entire team doesn't understand the data, does not have an intuition, you don't help them understand your intuition, you don't form it together, what generally ends up happening is you don't view the product through the lens of the many people that can use it. And there are mistakes that happen that you look back and you go, oh, why did that happen? I'll give you an example. In one of my roles previously, I had a product manager who would write these like large waterfall specs by himself and would turn it over to the engineering team. And one of the things we required was, and that was just the mode that they were working in. And it worked for them, but here are the things that would happen. When a user canceled the service is available both on the laptop as well as the phone. When they canceled the service, if they had an active session on the phone, they wouldn't get canceled out of that. Till they actually either shut their phone down or anything. Now, the product manager is like, hey, Mr. Engineer, why didn't you catch this? The engineer is like, hey, Mr. Product Manager, it wasn't in the spec. So really, I mean, that kind of intuition, the engineer genuinely did not have any intuition for what the usage is going to be, how people are going to use it, what can happen. They were just writing code. And that's what you don't want. You want everybody helping solve your problem, because at the end of the day, you yourself are never going to be able to uncover every single use case and everything the product is used for and its whole potential.
Yeah, just the quick, I think a lot of points were made. The only point I'll add is sometimes we also, as product folks, we fall into the trap of like really being very methodical and very process driven in terms of how we bring these insights together and so on and so forth. I think we also have to be very close partners with our engineering team to allow some level of flexibility and some time and some bandwidth for engineering teams to kind of explore things on their own, right? And more often than not, they will come up with better insights because they're closer to the problem, they're closer to the code. They will look at bugs differently. I mean, nobody wants to prioritize bugs ever, right? And I think that's something which is a big gap in a lot of product development processes, especially as you grow into a much bigger company. And I think it's important that engineers have the latitude and they really push it forward with regards to understanding what the pain points are and coming up with ideas themselves, as opposed to just being part of like, an overall process. So I think it's a thin line, it's a sort of a fine line you have to walk, and oftentimes I have noticed, at least in my career, that most of the good ideas, if not all of them, have actually come from engineers who are closest to the problem. And then the question as a product manager for you is how do you amplify the impact of that?
One of the things that I've told product managers over the years is engineers always write the final draft of your spec.
Yep.
So go into that knowing that you want to give people the context so that they can write that final draft well, and they can make the decisions that they're going to need to make that you as a PM will never have visibility into because you're not actually within the code, so that they can make those decisions that solve the problem that you had intended to solve.
So all of you have multiple products at this point, and we're talking about expansion, new ideas from engineers, getting them involved. Where do you draw the line between adding a new feature to an existing product versus creating a whole new product line? You have Uber Eats, you have this Swipe Night, you have the new product you just launched this weekend, Threads. How do you decide to spin into a new app or to create a whole new interface versus putting it into your core app?
Yeah, very relevant. Yesterday, we just launched a new product called Threads, which is a way to message visually just with your close friends. And the reason we did that was, if you really look at the problem that we're solving, which is how to create a more persistent connection with the people you really love, and you want to see more of their life, you want to have conversations more frequently and more easily, it's very hard to really achieve that well within a main Instagram product that does a lot of other things. And so I think if you think, we like to use the jobs theory, which is the jobs to be done. So the idea behind that is people don't use products, they hire them to perform specific jobs for them. And if you kind of frame it that way, it's kind of like, well, why are you being hired? And if you basically view the job of kind of talking to someone and having instant ability to write back or reply, it's very hard to really achieve it within a bigger app. And so the things that we ended up having in our standalone app, for instance, on the camera, it opens the camera. We add shortcuts to your favorite few people, so that throughout the day you can easily send photos or videos with just 2 taps, so right from the camera. It's based just on your close friends only, so the push notifications are all from people you know. And we have a product called Status as part of it that if you choose to opt in, it gives you high-level context throughout the day from your friends. Like you're on the move, you're in a park, you're at work. All of those things would be very difficult, if not impossible, to build within the Instagram app. And so I think when you see that divergence of what's the best version of this product, and then could it work within this product, and the answer is no, and it's a big enough use case that you think it can deserve a separate app, then usually you splinter. And if it's a single feature like the close friends story, which is a different example from last year when we launched that, it's just a way to share just to your close friends on a story for moments that are not for everyone. It integrates within the core Instagram app. It's a natural extension of using the Instagram camera, and you can just, instead of adding to your story, it's got a little icon for close friends story. It goes right into Instagram. It gets a green ring around it. Everyone knows it's different than the other stories, and it just fits really well. And that was basically 2 examples of one where we put it in the app and one where we had to spin out a new one.
One of the things I've been really surprised by all the user research that we've done with young people is how purposeful they are about organizing the home screen on their phone. This is, ultimately the dashboard for their lives. They spend a significant percentage of their waking hours on that screen, and so they're really thoughtful about what apps they put on the phone, how they're organized, and really thoughtful about why they open a particular app. And so I think the first decision that a person makes when they use your product is whether to open it at all. And so in order to think about whether something should be a new product or whether it should be a feature within your current product, I think it's important to back up to that moment where a person is deciding whether or not to open up your app and think about the purpose that you want them to have in terms of why they're going to open your app versus another app that you're thinking of building, and whether the purposes are well enough aligned that purpose can fit within your existing product, or to build on what Robby said is that it's divergent enough, that it's distinct enough, that it's clear enough that they're willing to open up a different product to do that. It is very difficult, especially once you're at scale, to build a new app that has a similar amount of scale to your core product. So that decision comes with a lot of weight. But if you really can solve for that purpose very clearly, and in that moment when a person is looking at their phone, they're deciding what they want to do, you feel like they need to make the decision to open one app versus another app, then absolutely I think that's the right decision to make, because it lets you clarify the purpose of each of the individual experiences that you're building for people.
Yeah, I think there are a bunch of good points made. What I'd say is each product serves a key purpose, has a key value proposition for the users that are using it. You want to keep things that enhance that value proposition should go in the same product, in my mind, right? If you add value propositions that are adjacent, you add a lot of crud to the use of the product. You make it more complex, it becomes harder, it's not as simple. So balancing simplicity is also important. And that's when you say, okay, this is going to be too complex. In Ravi's example, there are two use cases. If I put them both in one app, they're going to have to go, they're going to have to choose which flow. Does that make sense? That's when you spin off another product.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add to that is we also have to keep in mind how different markets are different, right? So we need to look at, what is the point of view for a Western consumer versus a consumer in Asia, and so on. And there are different design patterns in all these markets, right? So if you look at Asia, super apps are really common, right? So WeChat is a classic example where within one app, one app to rule it all, right? They have all the use cases built in, and they're very different use cases as well. So there's some sort of consumer choice over there. And there are other aspects as well, like if you have multiple apps and you have to download all those apps, people's phones may not even have enough storage or memory to be able to download so many apps. So I think it is not an easy decision. I think a lot of points were made around simplicity. I totally agree with that. I think it's also about what is the common sort of set of use cases that you want to enable, and how much extensibility is in your core product to sort of add. Is a new addition a feature, or is it a brand new product? And if it's a brand new product and you spin it out in a separate app, then you absolutely have to drive the awareness of it. You have to get people to download it and so on. So I don't think it's an easy enough decision to make, but obviously you have to really figure out what is going to be the constraint. If you were to put everything in one app, how does that make it worse for your core experience? And if that's what's going to happen, you absolutely should split it out.
And for Uber, you have several hundred cities. I mean, for the Uber app today, is it a different experience in different cities?
It is a different experience in different cities. So last year, almost 2 years ago, for a lot of the emerging markets, we launched a lighter version of our app, and other companies have done that as well. And that was because of the same factors of our core app was too heavy, and it was very high storage and not very performant for low network latencies or high network latencies in that case. So we did that. Now, I think for us, it's been really an interesting journey. When we first started Uber and we first started Uber Eats, I don't know if people remember, Uber Eats used to be like an icon on top of the Uber app, and then you can just get like a set of a set of food options over there. Then we split it out, and we had an Uber Eats app, and we drove the usage of that. And then last week again, we said we are experimenting with kind of putting it back in together. So I think we are trying, right? We are trying all these different aspects, because I think the fact is you have to again go back to what people are looking for. People are looking for convenience. So from Uber's example, it's the same payment, it's the same user, it's the same surface, it's the same kind of flow, the magical flow that people are used to. You push a button and you get something to happen. So I think we are experimenting a bunch with how do we evolve our app itself to have much more affordances for lots of different use cases that we want to solve, whether it's transportation or it's food or it's groceries and so on and so forth. So we are looking at a very seamless integration there. And at some point, of course, as those apps evolve, we will also have to see how much of those are done in a separate app. So it's a little bit of an evolution for us.
Great. I'm taking an audience question from Jeremy. Jeremy is interested in product failures. So obviously all of you have had long careers, you've iterated, you've worked on dozens and dozens of products. Some of those products have not worked out. When did you know they didn't work out? How did you know you were either wrong or it just didn't hit the market the right way? And how did you sort of shut them down?
Yeah, there's lots of examples there. I mean, I think the early days of Close Friends was a really good example. It took us about 2 years to get that product right. It's a really complicated product if you're thinking about carving out a separate space within Instagram just for close friends. And we originally applied it to feed and to stories. It was actually called Favorites as well. And we launched it in a few countries as a test because it was a complicated change, so we wanted to make sure we got it right before we went global with it. And what we saw in the data was that people who used it, it was all based on the retention curve. So it was a J curve, which is for people who try it day one, how many are still trying it 30, 60, 90 days later. And what we saw was that for this product, it was pretty obvious that the people that were using it stopped using it. But when we looked more deeply, we realized that they were continuing to use it for stories, but very few people used it for feed. And so we added a whole bunch of complexity for really no reason in that case. And so we spent a lot of time getting better at that, and ended up doing it just for stories, and ended up working out. But I think we mostly look at the retention and early usage, and then we talk to those people and say, hey, why? Looks like you didn't come back and use it again. Why? And then they give a pretty clear answer, and you realize, okay, there isn't product market fit. There wasn't something that naturally brought that person back to use this product. We didn't have enough value, or it was confusing to use, or some combination of the two.
I think, for me, there's been a bunch of product failures. I think all of us have it. For me, you always know in your gut something is off, like something is not working, something is not resonating. And while you're designing the product and going through the design, you are making trade-offs you are uncomfortable with, generally. And for me, it's always, every single time there has been some sort of a warning sign that says, okay, let's shoot it out to customers and see how it does. And inevitably, when you are not 100% sure about the value prop you're providing, or how you're building the product, or what it's supposed to deliver, and does the UI make it come to life, that's when I think that's when you're most likely to run into the need to change or failure, et cetera. Now, that's not necessarily wrong because you might need to experiment to actually get to the right answer, but you usually know when you're not down the right path.
I think one of the important things with failure is that it's true that, at the end of the day, a lot of products, in many cases, most products that PMs build do fail. It's very hard to find something that has really tight product market fit and is something that you can scale. I think a thing that's really important to try to solve for is to move that time when you're uncomfortable with the product as early in the process as possible. Oftentimes, things go wrong not because of execution, but because the fundamental hypothesis didn't work. And if you did a really good job with user research in the beginning, you could actually understand that the fundamental hypothesis wasn't working and then start to iterate at a point where it's much easier to move quickly. A few years ago, Tinder had a feature called Tinder Places. And the fundamental idea makes a lot of sense, which is that people want to meet other people based on the places that they go to. There are certain places that I go to, that everyone goes to, that are indicative of your identity, and you would want to meet other people within those places. But it turns out that the times when you go to those places are pretty infrequent, and most of the time when you're visiting a place, it's your days between home and work and the grocery store, and one of the most popular places in Tinder Places was McDonald's. Right? People go to these popular places that are not indicative of their identity, and so the feature that we built was really based on the popularity of the place rather than the ability for the place to create compatibility between two people. And so that's a case where if earlier on we had been clearer about the hypothesis, we might have detected that earlier. But once you're actually in market, it's pretty clear that there's something about the product that's not working quite right and not solving enough of a need that people are going to be highly retained in the product and getting the value that you want them to get from the product.
A question from the audience from Firdaus. What happens if a competitor executes on your product faster than you do? And there's already someone in the market, or maybe you're going up against an incumbent and there's already someone in the market. How do you sort of address what a competitor is maybe saying in their product marketing or communications to a user versus what you might want them to know?
I think for us, it's all about what your unique value in the world is, and really, really focusing on why what you are offering is the best version of that value proposition that's out there. And so I think something that we think a lot about is, okay, the point of Instagram is to go close to the people and things that you love. And what are the ways that you can do that? And how do we look at the strengths of Instagram and how we can uniquely solve that problem for people? And I think when you come from that place, you end up working in an area that's more unique to you, your company, your product. And also you approach it from a way where you're really focused on the people and just simply saying, well, people who are trying to do this with Instagram are having a hard time. Here's why. We're going to fix it with this new product. And I think as long as you're really focused there, try not to be too focused on the competition, and you have to just really, really play to the core value that people are seeing out of your product as much as possible.
Diya, I'm going to come to you. I mean, you're in a market that has a couple of different competitors in the space. How do you think about competition?
Yeah. So in many ways, competition is a validation that there's a problem. So it's not always bad, right? It is actually a good thing. If you go to any VC, if you're the only person with a given idea, chances are you won't get funded. The question is, how do you actually solve that problem, not just with the feature or the sub-product you're launching, but across your feature set, right? It's very close to what Robby said. How do you actually bring how do you actually solve that use case? So everybody says they're solving identity, right? They're solving identity for companies. They're doing it in many different ways. The unique value proposition that Okta brings is that we are actually solving it in a very platform way, which means you can use this one platform for many different use cases, whether you're using it for your employees, whether you're using it for your customers, whether you're using it to solve identity for apps, for servers, things like that, which no other company does. They have different products. Then we've also, the way we come at it is, we also think about your identity journey in your company, right? So like our core value proposition is not just helping you provide an identity management platform, it's actually making that identity fabric in your company. It's actually easing how you deploy that identity fabric in your company. So that's why if a competitor has launched a feature, that's great, but that doesn't mean that that feature or that product is able to deliver the same value you are, depending on how you built it and depending on what you built it on top of.
Yeah. The only thing I'd add is that, of course, you can't have your competition drive your own product narrative, right? You need to drive your own product narrative based on your customers and so on. And oftentimes what happens is if a category is growing really fast, you will have many competitors out there trying different things. But sometimes teams get very concerned, oh, they launched this feature, excuse me, they launched this feature. We have no idea whether that feature is even working for them, right? Just focus on your features and make your features work for yourself. Right? I think that is the more important thing. And oftentimes it's like splashy, people have launched this, they have launched that. It's probably not even working, right? So I think having a very strong point of view in terms of what's your own roadmap, you should of course keep an eye for competition because you can't just be in an isolated world. But at the same time, if you really are solving your customer pain points on a daily basis, moving the ball forward and ensuring that you're building with a very strong intent, providing a way for consumers to kind of really use your product, I think over time you'll win.
We just have a couple more minutes, but I'm taking one final question from the audience. If you had to go back in time and talk to your younger selves, you're at the sort of apotheosis of your careers, you're at prominent companies, big names. What would you tell to your early selves? You're 2-3 years into your career. What would you have changed?
I think for me, I would, if I were to zoom back, the things that I've learned over a career in product management is there's two things that are really important. One is having a passion for the problem that you're solving. People can work in lots of different spaces. When you work in a space that's aligned with what you really love to do, it becomes an accelerant, and you can do that much better. You can understand the problem better. You can empathize with the user better. You want to come into work every day. And then the second thing is, and this is something I learned later, is to really love the people that you're working with. That's a really important part of building successful products. When you're around a group of people that share that same passion, that you're excited to work with, then there's this magic that comes from being able to create things that are new and build things that are new and solve problems. And if you can get both of those aligned and work on something that you're passionate about with people that you love working with, that's the best place to be.
Yeah, I think from my standpoint, early on in my career, it would have been better if I had focused more on the evolution of data science and how data analytics has become such a strong function at this point for everything that we do in product management in particular. So it's not just about analyzing the data. Of course, every product you have to build, you look at the data and so on, but the kind of models that you build, especially for products that have monetization in them, the way you build those products, the way you think about different global scale and so on, my perspective, I think it would have been better for me to really have had focused on that and learning those skills earlier than later on in my career, because then I think I would have built actually better products along the way.
I think for me, I would say a lot of what Ravi said, but there's one thing that is different that I would add, which is if you genuinely like to build products, focus on industries where the problem hasn't really been solved, right, even early on, because then you get to try and learn a lot of different things. I don't mean go to an industry that is more in research mode, but there are tons of industries that are going to evolve, that will deliver value. It's just not clear how they will deliver the value. Those are the most interesting places to build products, and those are the places that you learn from the most. It sort of goes back to a question on why do so many people ended up at one of these three companies. Yeah. It's because they were doing that. And I did this unknowingly, but when I look back, those have been the most interesting and fruitful and the greatest learning experiences.
I think there's two for me. I think it really resonates to optimize for the people. Like the best jobs I've ever had or been around people that I feel like I'm constantly learning from. And the second one, which was great, is optimize for learning. Learning through data, learning through research, learning through people, and getting to a point where you're actually helping with your product is the only thing that actually matters more than any idea. I would have loved early on to take so many products and just kill them instantly and quickly, but you kind of like get into some of the things as you build it and you launch it, and it's really exciting. But if it's not helping someone, just kill it. And generally, if you kind of love building, but you love helping people more, then you actually will be happy to just kind of move on from your own product, which I think is a difficult thing to do. But to do that quickly and iterate and move along will get you to where you're going much faster. And I wish I could have done that faster in various times early in my career.
Thank you so much. All right, let's give a big round of applause for our panelists. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you.